In this psalm, we see, perhaps more than any psalm previously to this point, David's passionate plea for justice. He longs for God's judgment to come upon those who have stood against him. Note how David takes refuge in the Lord. Remember the idea of God's people taking refuge as mentioned at the end of Psalm 1. Note that David accepts responsibility for the actions that he is referring to in this psalm. Note also that David pleads for justice and anticipates that God will, in fact, vindicate him regarding whatever situation he is referring to. Note that God trusts in, or rather, David trusts in God's protection, knowing that God will deliver his wrath to those who have stood against him while keeping him safe because he has taken refuge in the Lord. And David also recognizes that the people, the violent, the wicked who are standing against him, will eventually uh, end up under God's judgment. And as he expresses it, uh, their actions will give birth to disillusionment. They will have fallen into a hole that they have dug for themselves. And then look at how David ends his prayer by expressing thanks and giving praise to God because he is confident that God will, in fact, intervene. We see in this psalm David's anticipation, his expectation that the coming king himself will experience such battles. And we know from the larger scope of Scripture, even as we reflect upon Jesus' life, teachings, ministry, his death and resurrection, how he faced such battles and stood in our place. And even as the words here are expressed in green that I pointed out earlier, can we really pray such words in our own integrity and righteousness? No, we can't. And so, perhaps more than any other aspect of this psalm, we see there in that uh, request, vindicate me, O Lord, according to my righteousness, according to my integrity, O Most High. How we as Christians fall short of being able to say that, but Jesus himself was able to plead that content, that request to God himself as he stood uh, in defense, so to speak, against those who uh, came against him. Look at Peter's statement about Jesus, as Peter wrote in expressed in 1 Peter 2:23. Peter says, when they hurled their insults at him, that is Jesus's opposition at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he who entrusted himself to him, that is God, who judges justly. Uh, Notice how, and I'm not going to read Romans 1:18 through 32, but that long passage very much reflects what is expressed here in the fifth stanza of this psalm, how God's wrath comes upon those who have stood against them, and it comes upon them largely in terms of consequences of their own actions, how they have chosen to respond to Him, the conduct they have chosen to pursue eventually ends up coming against them. Paul says in Romans chapter 1. So, uh, this psalm points to David's pleas for justice, recognizing that only God can save him and deliver him in God's own righteousness. We see how it points to the Messiah himself, how Jesus, uh, in his life and ministry, in his righteousness and integrity, stood in our place. And because he did, we ourselves, and it's only because he did, that we can even in any way identify with this psalm in praying to God for deliverance, in trusting him for his protection, in understanding that it's only because of what he has provided us that we can in any way even trust that uh, that the Messiah's righteousness is what allows us to be able to come to God Himself and ask for such deliverance and even expect it.